Hey, hey, hello, hello, hello. Happy day, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone out there whenever you are watching this. My name is Amy, and welcome to Southwest Shakespeare's Classics Reading. Wow, I totally just forgot the name of it. Storybook Classics Live, Storytime Classics Live. I should have written this down. Hey, it's Bo. Who will tell me?
Storytime Classics Live.
There we go. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't remember the order of the name. Storytime Classics Live. There we go. I knew someone would be around to help me. Either that or Catherine or Stanley probably would have popped in and told me. Welcome, welcome. Today we are reading Jamaica Inn by the stunning Daphne du Maurier. If you have not seen / listened to / read Rebecca with us, we did that before, kind of introduced us to this author, and all fell in love with her so much we decided to read another book by her. And we are not disappointed. This book is fantastic. It's quick. It's got some really scary characters and some really good characters and some terrible people, and it's really, really good. So before we jump in, I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to Miss Catherine James. Hello, who's watching us on the YouTube, and to say I hope you're doing well. And yes, I am fully expecting more nail biting today because we are in the thick of it. We are on page 241. It's Christmas. Christmas time, Christmas season, and we just got a visit from Harry the peddler, who is trying to get some of the booty from the wreckage that they caused on Christmas Day, and Uncle Joss is not having it, and Mary has just said, I will go to bed without supper, thank you very much. She's got something up her sleeve, so let's see what happens. Aunt Patience made a little murmur of distress, lifting her eyes from the plain slab of bread on the plate before her, but Joss Merlin kicked at her for silence. Let her stay sulky if she has the mind, can't you? He said. What does it matter to you if she eats or not? Starvation is good for women and beasts. It brings them to heel. She'll be humble enough in the morning. Wait, Mary, you shall sleep sounder still if I turn the key on you. I want no prowlers in the passage. His eyes strayed to the gun against the wall and half-consciously back to the shutter, which still gaped open before the kitchen window. Fasten that window, Patience, he said thoughtfully. Put the bar across the shutter. When you have finished your supper, you too can go to bed. I shall not leave the kitchen tonight. His wife looked up at him in fear, struck by the tone of his voice, and would have spoken, but he cut her short. Haven't you learned by now not to question me? He shouted. She rose at once and went to the window. Mary, her candle alight, waited by the door. All right, he said. Why are you standing there? I told you to go. Mary went out into the dark passage, her candle throwing her shadow behind her as she walked. No sound came from the store at the end of the passage, and she thought of the peddler lying there in the darkness, watching and waiting for the day. The thought of him was abhorrent to her, like a rat he was, imprisoned amongst his fellows, and she suddenly pictured him with rat's claws scratching and gnawing at the framework of the door, scraping his way to freedom in the silence of the night. She shuddered, strangely thankful that her uncle had decided to make a prisoner of her as well. The house was treacherous tonight. Her very footsteps sounded hollow on the flags, and there were echoes that came unbidden from the walls. Even the kitchen, the one room in the house to possess some measure of warmth and normality, gaped back at her as she left it, yellow and sinister in the candlelight. Was her uncle going to sit there then, the candles extinguished, his gun across his knee, waiting for something, for someone? He crossed into the hall as she mounted the stairs, and he followed her along the landing to the bedroom over the porch. Give me your key, he said. And she handed it to him without a word. He lingered for a moment, looking down at her, and then he bent low and laid his finger on her mouth. I have a soft spot for you, Mary, he said. You've got spirit still, and pluck for all the knocks I've given you. I've seen it in your eyes tonight. If I'd have been a younger man, I'd have courted you, Mary. Aye, and won you, too, and ridden away with you to glory. You know that, don't you? She said nothing. She stared back at him as he stood beyond the door, and her hand that held the candlestick trembled slightly without her knowledge. He lowered his voice to a whisper. There's danger for me ahead, he said. Never mind the law. I can bluff my way to freedom if it comes to that. The whole of Cornwall can come running at my heels for all I care. It's the other game I have to watch for. Footsteps, Mary, that come in the night and go again, and a hand that would strike me down. His face looked lean and old in the half-light, and there was a flicker of meaning in his eyes that leapt like a flame to tell her and then dulled again. We'll put the Tamar between us and Jamaica Inn, he said, and then he smiled, the curve of his mouth painfully familiar to her and known like an echo from the past. He shut the door upon her and turned the key. She heard him tramp down the stairs and so down into the passage, and he turned the corner to the kitchen and was gone. She went then to her bed and sat down upon it, her hands in her lap, and for some reason forever unexplained, thrust away from her for later and forgotten, side by side with the little old sins of childhood and those dreams never acknowledged to the sturdy day, she put her fingers to her lips as he had done and let them stray thence to her cheek and back again. And she began to cry softly and secretly, the tears tasting bitter as they fell upon her hand. Chapter 13. She had fallen asleep where she lay, without undressing, and her first conscious thought was that the storm had come again, bringing with it the rain which streamed against her window. She opened her eyes and saw that the night was still, without a tremor of wind from without or the patter of rain. Her senses were alert at once, and she waited for a repetition of the sound that had woken her. It came again in an instant, a shower of earth flung against the pane of glass from the yard outside. She swung her legs to the floor and listened, weighing in her mind and the possibility of danger. If this was a warning signal, the method was a crude one and better ignored. Someone with little idea of the geography of the inn might have mistaken her window for the landlord's. Her uncle waited below with his gun across his knee in preparation for a visitor. Perhaps the visitor had come and was now standing in the yard. Curiosity gained the better of her in the end, and she crept softly to the window, holding herself in the shadow of the jutting wall. The night was black still, and there were shadows everywhere, but low in the sky a thin line of cloud foretold the dawn. She had not been mistaken, though. The earth on the floor was real enough, and so was the figure standing directly beneath the porch, the figure of a man. She crouched by the window, waiting for his further movement. He bent again to the ground, fumbling in the barren flower bed outside the parlor window, and then he raised his hand and threw the little clod of earth at her window, pattering the pane with pebbles and soft mud. This time she saw his face, and the wonder of it made her cry out in surprise, forgetting the caution to which she had trained herself. It was Jem Merlin standing below her in the yard. She leant forward at once, opening her window, and would have called to him, but he lifted his hand for silence. He came close against the wall, skirting the porch, which would have hidden her from him, and he cupped his hands to his mouth and whispered up to her, "Come down to the door here and unbolt it for me." She shook her head at him. "I can't do that. I'm locked up in my room," she told him. He stared at her, nonplussed and evidently puzzled, and he looked back at the house as though it might offer some solution of its own. He ran his hands along the slates, testing them, feeling for rusted nails used long ago for creepers that might afford him foothold of a sort. The low tiles of the porch were within his reach, but they had no gripped surface. He would swing his legs from the ground to no purpose. "Fetch me the blanket from your bed," he called softly. She guessed at once his meaning and tied one end of her blanket to the foot of her bed, throwing the other end out of the window where it dragged limply above his head. This time he had holding power, and swinging himself to the low roof of the jutting porch, he was able to wedge his body between it and the walls of the house, his feet gripping the slates, and in this manner haul himself up the porch on a level with her window. He swung his legs over and straddled the porch, his face close to hers now, the blanket hanging loosely beside him. Mary struggled with the framework of the window, but her efforts were useless. The window opened only a foot or two. He could not enter the room without smashing the glass. "I shall have to talk to you here," he said. "Come closer where I can see you." She knelt on the floor of her room, her face at the window gap, and they stared at one another for a moment without speaking. He looked worn, and his eyes were hollow, like the eyes of one who has not slept and has endured fatigue. There were lines about his mouth she had not noticed before, nor did he smile. "I owe you an apology," he said at length. "I deserted you without excuse at Launceston and Christmas Eve. You can forgive me or not as you feel, but the reason for it, that I can't give you, and I'm sorry." This attitude of harshness did not suit him. He appeared to have changed much, and the change was unwelcome to her. I was anxious for your safety, she said. I traced you to the White Hart, and there I was told you had entered a carriage with some gentleman. Nothing beyond that. No message, no word of explanation. Those men were there, standing before the fire, the horse dealer who spoke with you in the market square. They were horrible men, curious, and I mistrusted them. I wondered if the theft of the pony had been discovered. I was wretched and worried. I blame you for nothing. Your business is your own. She was hurt by his manner. She had expected anything but this. When she saw him first in the yard outside her window, she thought of him only as the man she loved who had come now to her in the night, seeking her presence. His coolness damped her flame, and she withdrew inside herself at once, trusting that he had not seen the blank disappointment on her face. He did not even ask how she returned that night, and his indifference stunned her. "Why are you locked in your room?" he questioned. She shrugged her shoulders, and her voice was flat and dull when she replied. "My uncle does not care for eavesdroppers. He fears I should wander in the passage and stumble upon his secrets. You appear to have the same dislike of intrusion. To ask you why you are here tonight would be an offense, I suppose?" "Oh, be as bitter as you like. I deserve it," he flashed suddenly. "I know what you think of me. One day I may be able to explain, if you're not out of my reach by then. Be a man for a moment and send your hurt pride and your curiosity to hell. I'm treading delicate ground, Mary, and one false step will finish me. Where's my brother?" "He told us he would spend the night in the kitchen. He's afraid of something or someone. The windows and doors are barred, and he has his gun." Jem laughed harshly. "I don't doubt he's afraid. He'll be more frightened still before many hours are past, I can tell you that. I came here to see him, but if he sits there with a gun across his knees, I can postpone my visit until tomorrow, when the shadows are gone." "Tomorrow might be too late." "What do you mean?" "He intends to leave Jamaica Inn at nightfall." "Are you telling me the truth?" "Why would I lie to you now?" Jem was silent. The news had evidently come as a surprise to him, and he was turning it over in his mind. Mary watched him, tortured by doubt and indecision. She was thrown back now upon her old suspicion of him. He was the visitor expected by her uncle, and therefore hated by him and feared. He was the man who held the threads of her uncle's life between his hands. The sneering face of the peddler returned to her again, and his words that so provoked the landlord to a flame of fury. "Listen here, Joss Merlin. Do you take your orders from someone above you?" The man whose wits made service of the landlord's strengths, the man who had hidden in the empty room. She thought again of the laughing, carefree Jem who had driven her to Lawston, who had swung hands with her in the market square, who had kissed her and held her. Now he was grave and silent, his face in shadow. The idea of dual personalities troubled her and frightened her as well. He was like a stranger to her tonight, obsessed by some grim purpose she could not understand. Warning him of the landlord's intended flight had been a false move on her part. It might confound the issue of her plans. Whatever Jem had done or intended to do, whether he was false and treacherous and a murderer of men, she loved him in the weakness of her flesh and owed him warning. "You best have care for yourself when you see your brother," she said. "His mood is dangerous. Whoever interferes with his plans now risks his life. I tell you this for your own safety." "I have no fear of Joss, nor ever had." "Perhaps not, but what if he's afraid of you?" To this he said nothing, but, leaning forward suddenly, he looked into her face and touched the scratch that ran from her forehead to her chin. "Who did this?" he said sharply. Turning from the scratch to the bruise on her cheek, she hesitated a moment and then answered them. "I got them Christmas Eve." The gleam in his eye told her at once that he understood and had knowledge of the evening, and because of it was here now at Jamaica Inn. "You were there with them on the shore?" he whispered. She nodded, watching him carefully, wary of speech, and for answer he cursed aloud and, reaching forward, smashed the pane of glass with his fist, careless of the splitting sound of glass and the blood that spouted immediately from his hand. The gap in the window was wide enough now for entrance, and he had climbed into the room and was beside her before she realized what he had done. He lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bed and laid her down upon it, and fumbling in the darkness for a candle, he found it at length and lit it, and came back to the bed and knelt beside it, throwing the light upon her face. He traced the bruises with her finger down her neck, and when she winced with the pain, he drew his breath quickly, and again he heard him swear. I might have spared you this, he said, and then blowing out the light, he sat down beside her on the bed and reached for her hand, which he held a moment tight and then gave back to her. God Almighty, why did you go with them? He said. They were crazy with drink. I don't think they knew what they were doing. I could no more have stood against them than a child. There were a dozen of them or more, and my uncle, he led them. He and the peddler. If you know about it, why do you ask me? Don't make me remember. I don't want to remember. How much have they hurt you? Bruises, scratches, you can see for yourself. I tried to escape, and I grazed my side. They caught me again, of course. They bound my hands and feet down on the shore and tied sacking over my mouth so that I could not scream. I saw the ship come through the mist, and I could do nothing. Alone there in the wind and the rain, I had to watch them die. She broke off, her voice trembling, and she turned to her side, her face in her hands. He made no move towards her. He sat there silently on the bed beside her. She felt him far from her, wrapped in secrecy. She was lonelier then than before. Was it my brother who hurt you most? He said presently. She sighed wearily. It was all too late, and it did not matter now. He was drunk, she said. You know better than I, perhaps, what he can do then. Yes, I know. He paused a moment, and then once again he took her hand. He shall die for this, he said. His death will not bring back the men he killed. I'm not thinking of them now. If you're thinking of me, don't waste your sympathy. I can revenge myself in my own way. I've learned one thing at least, to rely on myself. Women are frail things, Mary, for all their courage. You are best out of this business now. The issue lies with me. She did not answer him. Her plans were her own, and she did not enter into them. What do you intend to do? He asked. I have not made up my mind, she lied. If he leaves tomorrow night, you have little time to decide, he said. He expects me to go with him, and Aunt Patience as well. And you? That will depend upon tomorrow. Whatever she felt for him, she would not hazard her plans into his keeping. He was still an unknown quantity, and above all else an enemy to justice. It came to her then that by betraying her uncle, she might also betray him. If I ask you to do something, how would you answer me? She asked. He smiled then for the first time, mocking and indulgent, as he had done in Launceston, and her heart leapt to him at once, encouraged at the change. How can I tell? He said. I want you to go away from here. I am going now. No, I mean away from the moors, away from Jamaica Inn. I want you to tell me you won't return here again. I can stand up against your brother. I'm no danger from him now. I don't want you to come here tomorrow. Please, promise me you'll go away. What have you got on your mind? Something which has no concern with you, but might bring you to danger. I can't say any more. I rather you trusted me. Trust you? Good God, of course I trust you. It's you who won't trust me, you damn little fool. He laughed silently and bent down to her, putting his arm around her, and he kissed her then as he had kissed her in Launceston, but deliberately now, with anger and exasperation. Play your own game by yourself, then, and leave me to play mine, he told her. If you must be a boy, I can't stop you, but for the sake of your face, which I have kissed and shall kiss again, keep away from danger. You don't want to kill yourself, do you? I have to leave you now. It will be daylight within the hour, and if both our plans miscarry, what then? Would you mind if you never saw me again? No, of course you would not care. I have not said so. You hardly understand. Women think differently than men. They travel separate paths. That's why I have no liking for them. They make trouble and confusion. It was pleasure enough to take you to Launceston, Mary, but when it comes to life and death, like my business now, God knows I wish you 100 miles away, or sitting primly, your sewing in your lap in a trim parlor somewhere where you belong to be. That's never been my life, nor ever will. Why not? You'll wed a farmer one day, or small tradesman, and live respectfully among your neighbors. Don't tell them you lived once at Jamaica Inn and had love made to you by a horse thief. They'd shut their door against you. Goodbye, and here's prosperity to you. He rose from the bed towards the window, climbing through the gap he had broken in the pane, and swinging his legs over the porch with one hand on the blanket, he lowered himself to the ground. She watched him from the window, instinctively waving him farewell, but he had turned and gone without looking back at her, slipping across the yard like a shadow. Slowly, she pulled up the blanket and replaced it on the bed. Morning would soon be here. She would not sleep again. She sat on her bed, waiting until her door should be unlocked. She made her plans for the evening to come. She must not draw suspicion upon herself during the day. She must act passively, sullenly perhaps, as though feeling had at last been stifled in her, and she was prepared to undertake the proposed journey with the landlord and Aunt Patience. Then, later, she would make some excuse, fatigue perhaps, a desire to rest in her room before the strain of the night journey, and then would come the most dangerous moment of her day. She would have to leave Jamaica Inn secretly and unobserved, and run like a hare to Alternan. This time Francis Davy would understand. Time would be against them, and he must act accordingly. She would then return to the inn, with his approval, and trust that her absence had remained unnoticed. This was the gamble. If the landlord went to her room and found her gone, her life would be worth nothing. She must be prepared for that. No excuse would save her then. But if he believed her to be sleeping still, then the game would continue. They would make preparations for the journey. They might even climb into the cart and come out upon the road. After that, her responsibility would end. Their fate would be in the hands of the vicar of Alternan. Beyond this, she could not think, nor had she any great desire to look ahead. So Mary waited for the day, and when it came, the long hours stretched interminably before her. Every minute was an hour, and an hour a particle of eternity itself. The atmosphere of strain was apparent amongst them all. In silence, haggardly, they waited for the night. Little progress could be made during the light of the day. Intrusion was always possible. Aunt Patience wandered from kitchen to her room. Her footsteps pattered incessantly in the passage and on the stairs, as she made helpless and ineffectual preparations. She would make bundles of what poor clothes remained to her, and then undo them again, when the memory of some forgotten garment jogged her wandering mind. She potted in the kitchen aimlessly, opening the cupboards, looking into drawers, and she fingered her pots and pans with restless fingers, incapable of deciding which to take and which to leave behind. Mary helped her as best she could, but the unreality of her task made it the more difficult. She knew, while her aunt did not, that all this labor was in vain. Her heart misgave her at times, when she allowed her thoughts to dwell upon the future. How would Aunt Patience act? How would she look when they came to take her husband from her? She was a child, and must be tended as a child. Again, she pattered from the kitchen, climbing the stairs to her room, and Mary would hear her drag her box on the floor, pace up and down, as she wrapped a single candlestick in a shawl and put it side by side with a cracked teapot and a faded muslin cap, only to unwrap them again and discard them for treasures more ancient. Jos Merlin would watch her moodily, cursing her irritation now and again as she dropped something on the floor or caught her foot and stumbled. His mood had changed again overnight. His watch in the kitchen had not improved his temper, and the very fact that the hours had been undisturbed and his visitor had not come upon him made him, if possible, more restless than before. He roamed about the house, nervy and abstracted, muttering to himself at times, peering from the windows as though he expected to see someone come up him unawares. His nerves reacted upon his wife and Mary. Aunt Patience watched him anxiously, and she too turned her eyes to the window and would listen, her mouth working, her hands twisting in her apron. No sound came from the peddler in the barred room, nor did the landlord go to him or mention him by name, and his silence was sinister in itself, strange and unnatural. Had the peddler shouted obscenities or thundered on the door, it would have been more and more in keeping with his character, but he lay there in the darkness without sound or movement, and for all her loathing of him, Mary shuddered at the possibility of his death. At the midday meal, they sat round the table in the kitchen, eating silently, furtively almost. And the landlord, who usually had the appetite of an ox, drummed moodily with his fingers on the table, the cold meat on his plate untouched. Once Mary lifted her eyes and saw him staring at her beneath his shaggy brows. The wild fear ran through her mind that he suspected her and had some knowledge of her plans. She had counted upon his high humor of the preceding night and had been prepared to fall in with it if necessary, answer banter with banter, setting no opposition to his will. But he sat sullen, though, wrapped in gloom. And this was a mood she had experienced before, and she knew now led to danger. At length, she took courage in both hands and asked him what time he intended to leave Jamaica Inn. "When I am prepared," he told her shortly, and would say no more. She schooled herself to continue, though, and when she had helped to clear the meal away and, at her own suggestion, adding deceit upon deceit, had impressed upon her aunt the necessity of packing a basket of provisions against the journey, she turned to her uncle and spoke again. "If we are to travel tonight," she said, "would it not be better if Aunt Patience and myself rested now during the afternoon, and so could start out fresh upon the journey? There will be no sleep for any of us tonight. Aunt Patience has been on her feet since daybreak, and I, too, for that matter. We do little good, as far as I can see, waiting here for dusk to fall." She kept her voice as casual as possible, but the tight band across her heart was a sign that she waited his answer with misgiving, and she could not look into his eyes. He debated the matter a moment, and to control her anxiety, she turned away and pretended to fumble in the cupboard. "You may rest if you will," he said at length. "There'll be work for you both later. You are right when you say there will be no sleep for you tonight. Go then. I shall be well rid of you for the time." The first step had been achieved, and Mary lingered a while with her pretended work in the cupboard, fearing that haste to leave the kitchen would be judged suspicious. Her aunt, who acted always like a dummy to suggestion, followed her meekly upstairs when the time came, and padded along the further passage to her own room, as an obedient child would do. Mary entered her own little room above the porch and closed the door, turning the key. Her heart beat fast at the prospect of adventure, and she could hardly tell whether excitement or fear had the mastery. It was close on 4 miles to Alternan by the road, and she could walk the distance in an hour. If she left Jamaica Inn at 4 o'clock, when the light was failing, she would be back again soon after 6, and the landlord would hardly come to rouse her before 7. She had 3 hours then in which to play her part, and she had already determined upon her method of departure. She would climb out onto the porch and fall to the ground, as Jem had done this morning. The drop was an easy one, and she would escape with little more than a scratch and a jar to her nerves. At any rate, it would be safer to do this than to risk coming upon her uncle in the passage below. The heavy entrance door would never open noiselessly, and to go through the bar would mean passing the open kitchen. She put on her warmest dress and fastened her old shawl across her shoulders with trembling, hot hands. It was the enforced delay that irked her the most. Once she was upon the road, the purpose of the walk would bring courage, and the very movement of her limbs would be a stimulant. She sat by the window, looking out upon the bare yard and the high road where no one ever passed, waiting for the clock in the hall below to strike 4. When it sounded at last, the strokes rang out in the silence like an alarm, pounding her nerves. And unlocking the door, she listened for a moment, hearing footsteps echo the strokes and whispers in the air. It was her imagination, of course. Nothing moved. The clock ticked on the next hour. Every second was precious to her now, and she must waste no time to be gone. She shut the door, locking it again, and went to the window. She crawled through the gap, as Jem had done, her hands on the sill, and in a moment she was astride the porch, looking down upon the ground. The distance seemed greater, now that she crouched above it, and she had no blanket to control her fall and let her swing as he had done. The tiles of the porch were slippery and gave no grip to hands. She turned, clinging desperately to the security of the windowsill that seemed desirable suddenly, and a thing well known. Then she shut her eyes and launched herself into the air. Her feet found the ground almost immediately. The jump was nothing, as she had already foreseen, but the tiles had grazed her hands and arms and brought back her again a vivid memory of her last fall from the carriage in the gullyway beside the shore. She looked up at Jamaica Inn, sinister and gray in the approaching dusk. The windows barred. She thought of the horrors the house had witnessed, the secrets now embedded in its walls, side by side with the other old memories of feasting and firelight and laughter before her uncle cast his shadow upon it. And she turned away from it, as one turns instinctively from a house of the dead, and went out upon the road. The evening was fine, that at least favored her, and she strode out towards her destination with the eyes fixed upon the long white road that lay ahead. Dusk came as she walked, bringing shadows across the moor that lay on either side of her. Away to the left, the high tors, shrouded at first in mist, were gathered in the darkness. It was very still. There was no wind. Later, there would be a moon. She wondered if her uncle had reckoned with this force of nature that would shine upon his plans. For herself, it did not matter. Tonight, she had no fear of the moors. They did not concern her. Her business was with the road. The moors lost their significance when unnoticed and untrodden. They loomed beyond her and away from her. She came at length to the 5 lanes where the roads branched, and she turned to her left down the steep hill of Alternan. Excitement rose high within her now as she passed the twinkling cottage lights and smelt the friendly smoke of chimneys. Here were neighborly sounds that had long been lost to her. The barking of a dog, the rustle of trees, the clank of a pail as a man drew water from a well. There were open doors and voices from within. Chickens clucked beyond a hedge, and a woman called shrilly to a child who answered with a cry. A cart lumbered past her in the shadows, and the driver gave her a good evening. Here was a drowsy movement, a placidity and a peace. Here were all the old village smells she knew and understood. She passed them by, and she went to the vicarage beside the church. There were no lights here. The house was shrouded and silent. The trees closed in upon it, and once again she was vividly aware of her first impression that this was the house that lived in its own past and slept now with no knowledge of the present. She hammered upon the door, and she heard the blows echo through the empty house. She looked in through the windows, and her eyes met nothing but the soft and negative darkness. Then, cursing her stupidity, she turned back again towards the church. Francis Davy would be there, of course. It was Sunday. She hesitated a moment, uncertain of her movements, and then the gate opened, and a woman came out from the road carrying her flowers. She stared hard at Mary, knowing her a stranger, and would have passed her by with a good night, had not Mary turned and followed her. "Forgive me," she said. "I see you've come from the church. Can you tell me if Mr. Davy himself is here?" "No, he's not," said the woman. And then after a moment, "Were you wishing to see him?" "Very urgently," said Mary. "I've come to this house and I can get no answer. Can you help me?" The woman looked at her curiously and then shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "The vicar is from home. He went away today to preach at another parish many miles from here. He's not expected back in Alternan tonight." Chapter 14. At first, Mary stared at the woman in disbelief. "Away from home?" she repeated. "But that's impossible. Surely you're mistaken." Her confidence had been such that she rejected instinctively this sudden and fatal blow to her plans. The woman looked offended. She saw no reason why this stranger should doubt her word. "The vicar left Alternan yesterday afternoon," she said. "He rode away after dinner. I ought to know, for I keep house for him." She must have seen something in the agony of disappointment in Mary's face, for she relented and spoke with kindness. "If there's any message you would like me to give him when he does return," she began. But Mary shook her head hopelessly, spirit and courage gone from her in a moment with the news. Yes, Catherine, if you can't trust the vicar to be at church on the Sunday, what can you trust? Nothing, apparently. Apparently, Mary can trust nothing. Oh, I should have seen it coming. "It will be too late," she said in despair. "This is a matter of life and death. With Mr. Davy gone, I don't know where I can turn." Once more, a gleam of curiosity came into the woman's eyes. "Has someone been taken sick?" she inquired. "I could point out where our doctor lives, if that would help you. Where have you come from tonight?" Mary did not answer. She was thinking desperately of some way out of the situation. To come to Alternan and then return again without help to Jamaica Inn was impossible. She could not place confidence in the village people, nor would they believe her tale. She must find someone in authority, someone who knew something of Joss Merlin and Jamaica Inn. "Who is the nearest magistrate?" she said at length. The woman plucked her brow and considered the question. "There's no one close by us here at Alternan," she said doubtfully. "Why, the nearest would be Squire Bassett over in North Hill, and that must be over 4 miles from here. Maybe more, maybe less. Cannot say for certain, for I've never been there. You surely would not walk out there tonight." "I must," said Mary, "for there is something else for me to do. I must lose no time either. Forgive me for being so mysterious, but I am in great trouble, and only your vicar or a magistrate can help me. Can you tell me if the road to North Hill is hard to find?" "No, that's easy enough. You go 2 miles along Launceston Road and then turn right by the turnpike. But it's scarcely a walk for a maid like you after nightfall, and I'd never go myself. There's rough folk on the moors at night, and you cannot trust them. We dare not venture from our homes these days, with robbery on the high road even, and violence too." "Thank you for your sympathy. I am very grateful to you," said Mary. "But I have lived all my life in lonely places, and I am not afraid." "You must please yourself," answered the woman, "but you best stay here and wait for the vicar if you can." "That isn't possible," said Mary. "But when he does return, could you tell him perhaps that— Wait, though. If you have paper and pen, I will write him a note of explanation. That would be better still. Come to my cottage here, and you may write what you will." "When you have gone, I can take the note to his house at once and leave it on his table, where he will see it as soon as he comes home." Mary followed the woman to the cottage and waited impatiently while she searched her kitchen for a pen. The time was slipping away fast, and the added journey to North Hill had upset every former calculation. She could hardly return to Jamaica Inn once she had seen Mr. Bassett, and still hope her absence had remained unnoticed. Her uncle would take warning from her flight and leave the inn before the intended time, in which case her mission would have been in vain. Now the woman returned with paper and quill, and Mary wrote desperately, never pausing to choose her words. "I came here to ask your help, and you were gone. By now you will have heard with horror, as everyone in the country must have done, of the wreck upon the coast on Christmas Eve. It was my uncle's doing, he and the company from Jamaica Inn. That you will have guessed already. He knows that suspicion will fall on him before long, and because of this, he plans to leave the inn tonight and cross the Tamar into Devon. Finding you absent, I will go now with all possible haste to Mr. Bassett at North Hill to tell everything to him, and warn him of the escape, so that he can send at once to Jamaica Inn to seize my uncle before it's too late. I'm giving this note to your housekeeper, who will, I trust, lay it where your eyes will fall upon you directly you return. In haste, then, Mary Yellan." This she folded and gave to the woman by her side, thanking her and assuring her that she had no fear of the road, and so set out again upon a walk of 4 miles or more to North Hill. She climbed the hill from Alternon with a heavy heart and a wretched sense of isolation. She had placed such faith in Francis Davy that it was hard to realize even yet that in his absence he had failed her. He had not known, of course, that she needed him, and even if he had, perhaps his plans would have come before her troubles. It was disheartening and bitter to leave the lights of Alternon behind her, with nothing as yet accomplished. At this moment, perhaps, her uncle was thundering upon her bedroom door, calling her to answer. He would wait a moment and then force the door. He would find her gone, and the smashed window would tell him the manner of her going. Whether this would play havoc on his plans was a matter for conjecture. She could not know. Aunt Patience was her concern, and the thought of her setting out upon the journey like a shivering dog tethered to its master made Mary run along the bare white road with fists clenched and thin chin thrusting in the air. She came at last to the turnpike and turned down the narrow, twisting lane as the woman in Alternon had told her. High hedges screened the country on either side, and the dark moor was thrusted away and hidden from her eyes. The road twisted and turned, as the lanes in Helford used to do, and this change of scene, coming so suddenly after the bleak high road, put faith in her once more. She cheered herself by painting a picture of the Bassett family as kindly and as courteous, like the Verians of Tullowarren, who would listen to her in sympathy and understanding. She had not seen the squire at his best before. He had come upon Jamaica Inn in high ill humor, and she thought now with regret of the part she had played in his deception. As for his lady, she must know now that a horse thief had made a fool of her in Launceston Market Square, and it was lucky for Mary that she had not stood at Jem's side when the pony was sold back to its rightful owner. She continued on with her fantasy of the Bassetts, but the little incidents came back to her in spite of it, and in the bottom of her heart she looked upon the approaching interview with trepidation. The contour of the land had changed again, and hills rose away from her, forested and dark, and somewhere beyond her ran a stream singing and breaking over stones. The moorland was no more. The moon came now, topping the further trees, and she walked in confidence with the light blazing a path for her, leading her downward to the valley, where the trees closed in friendliness upon her. She came at last to 2 lodge gates and the entrance to a drive, while beyond her the lane continued to a village. That must be North Hill, and this the manor house belonging to the squire. She went down the avenue to the house, and away in the distance a church clock struck 7. She had been about 3 hours already from Jamaica Inn. Her nervousness returned as she rounded upon the house, large and forbidding in the darkness, with the moon not yet risen high enough to shine kindly upon it. She swung the great bell, and the sound was met at once by the furious baying of hounds. She waited, and presently she heard footsteps from within, and the door was opened by a manservant. He called sharply at the dogs, who thrust their noses at the door and sniffed at Mary's feet. She felt inferior and small, and was conscious of her old dress and shawl before this man, who waited for her to speak. "I have come to see Mr. Bassett on very urgent business," she told him. "He would not know my name, but if he could speak to me for a few minutes, I would explain. The matter is of desperate importance. Otherwise, I would not disturb him at such an hour and on a Sunday night." "Mr. Bassett left for Launceston this morning," answered the man. "He was called away hurriedly, and he has not yet returned." This time Mary could not control herself, and a cry of despair escaped her. "I have come some way," she said, in agony of feeling, as though by her very distress she could bring the squire to her side. "If I do not see him within the hour, something terrible will happen, and a great criminal escape the hands of the law. You look at me blankly, but I am speaking the truth. If only there was someone I could turn to." "Mrs. Bassett is at home?" said the man, struggling with curiosity. "Perhaps she will see you, if your business is as urgent as you say. Follow me, I will you to the library. Never mind the dogs, they will not hurt you." Mary, on a Sunday, right, Catherine? It's Sunday. Aren't you supposed to be at home on Sunday, especially in this type of, like, town, this village? Something's going on. Something is going on. I don't know what that. Mary crossed the hall in a dream, knowing only that her plan had failed again through chance alone, and that she was powerless now to help herself. The wide library, with its blazing fire, seemed unreal to her, and, accustomed as she was to the darkness, she blinked at the flood of light that met her eyes. A woman whom she recognized immediately as the fine lady from Launceston Market Square was sitting in a chair before the fire, reading aloud to two children, and she looked up in surprise when Mary was shown into the room. The servant began his explanation in some excitement. "This young woman has very grave news for the squire, madam. I thought it best to show her in to you directly." Mrs. Bassett rose to her feet at once, dropping the book from her lap. "It isn't one of the horses, is it?" she said. "Richard told me Solomon had been coughing, and that Diamond could not take his food. With this undergroom, anything may happen." Mary shook her head. "Your household is not in trouble," she said gravely. "I bring news of another kind. If I could speak to you alone—" Mrs. Bassett appeared relieved that her horses were not affected, and she spoke quickly to her children, who ran from the room, followed by the manservant. "What can I do for you?" she said graciously. "You look pale and frightened. Won't you sit down?" Mary shook her head impatiently. "Thank you, but I must know when Mr. Bassett is returning home." "I have no idea," replied his lady. "He was obliged to leave this morning at a moment's notice, and, to tell you the truth, I am seriously concerned about him. If this dreadful innkeeper shows fight, as he is certain to do, Mr. Bassett may be wounded in spite of the soldiers." "What do you mean?" said Mary swiftly. "Why, the squire has set upon a highly dangerous mission. Your face is new to me, and I conclude you are not from North Hill. Otherwise, you would have heard of this man, Merlin, who keeps an inn upon the Bodmin Road. The squire has suspected him for some while. There it is. The squire has suspected him for some while of terrible crimes, but it was not until this morning that the full proof came into his hands. He departed at once for Launceston to summon him, and summon help, and from what he told me before he went, he intends to surround the inn tonight and seize the inhabitants. He will go well armed, of course, and with a large body of men, but I shall not rest until he returns." Something in Mary's face must have warned her, for she turned very pale and backed towards the fire, reaching out for the heavy bell-pull that rung on the wall. "You're the girl he spoke about," she said quickly. "The girl from the inn, the niece of the landlord. Stay where you are. Don't move, or I'll summon my servants." "You are the girl. I know it. He described you to me. What do you want with me?" Mary put her hand, her face as white as the woman's by the fire. "I won't hurt you," she said. "Please do not ring. Let me explain. Yes, I am the girl from Jamaica Inn. Mrs. Bassett did not trust her. She watched Mary with troubled eyes and kept hand upon bell rope. I have no money here, she said. I can do nothing for you. If you have come to North Hill to plead for your uncle, it is too late. You misunderstand me, said Mary quietly. And the landlord of Jamaica Inn is a relative to me by marriage only. Why I have been living there does not matter now, and the story would take too long in the telling. I fear and detest him more than you or anyone in the country, and with reason. I came here to warn Mr. Bassett that the landlord intended to leave the inn tonight and to escape justice. I have definite proof of his guilt, which I do not believe Mr. Bassett to possess. You tell me that he is already gone, and perhaps even now is at Jamaica Inn. Therefore, I have wasted my time coming here. She sat down then, her hands in her laps, and stared blankly at the fire. She had come to the end of her resources, and for the moment she could not look ahead. All that her weary mind could tell her was that her labor of the evening had been purposeless and in vain. She need never have left her bedroom at Jamaica Inn. Mr. Bassett would have come in any case. And now, by her secret meddling, she had blundered into the very mistake she had wished to avoid. She had stayed away too long, and by now her uncle would have guessed the truth and in all probability made his escape. Squire Bassett and his men would ride to a deserted inn. She lifted her eyes once more to the lady of the house. I have done very senseless thing in coming here, she said hopelessly. I thought it clever, and I have only succeeded in making a fool of myself and everyone else. My uncle will discover my room is empty and guess at once that I have betrayed him. He will leave Jamaica Inn before Mr. Bassett arrives. The squire's lady let go of the bell rope now and came towards her. You speak sincerely, and you have an honest face, she said kindly. I'm sorry if I misjudged you at first, but Jamaica Inn has a terrible name, and I believe anyone would have done the same had they been confronted suddenly with a landlord's niece. You have been placed in a fearful position, and I think you very brave to come here tonight, all those lonely miles, to warn my husband. I should have gone mad with fear. The question is this. What would you have me do now? I'm willing to help you in any way you think best. There's nothing we can do, said Mary, shaking her head. I must wait here, I suppose, until Mr. Bassett returns. He won't be overpleased to see me when he hears how I have blundered. God knows I deserve every reproach. I will speak for you, replied Mrs. Bassett. You could not possibly know my husband had already been informed, and I will soon smooth him down if he needs it. Be thankful you are here in safety meanwhile. How did the squire learn the truth so suddenly? Asked Mary. I have not the slightest idea. He was sent for very suddenly this morning, as I have told you already, and he only gave me the barest details before his horse was saddled and he was gone. Now, won't you rest yourself and forget for the time the whole hateful business? You are probably famished for want of food. Once more she approached the fireplace, and this time she pulled the bell rope 3 or 4 times. For all the worry and distress, Mary could not help see the irony of the situation. Here was a lady of the house offering hospitality who a moment ago had threatened her with a seizure by the same servants who would now bring her food. She thought also of the scene in the market square when this same lady, in velvet cloak and feathered hat, had paid a high price for her own pony, and she wondered whether the trickery had been discovered. If Mary's own part in this deception should come to light, Mrs. Bassett would hardly be so lavish with her hospitality. Meanwhile, the servant appeared, his inquisitive nose in the air, and was told by his mistress to bring a tray of supper for Mary, and the dogs, who had followed him into the room, came now to make friends with the stranger, wagging their tails and pushing their soft noses into her hands, accepting her as a member of the household. Her presence in the manor house at North Hill was still without reality, and though Mary tried, she could not throw aside anxiety and relax. She felt she had no right to be sitting here before a glowing fire when outside, in the darkness, life and death fought hand to hand before Jamaica Inn. She ate mechanically, forcing herself to swallow the food she needed, aware of the prattle of her hostess at her side, who in the mistaken kindness of her heart believed that incessant conversation without nothing at all was the only method of alleviating worry. The chatter, had she but realized, increased it, and when Mary had finished her supper and sat once more with her hands in her lap, staring at the fire, Mrs. Bassett, searching her mind for a suitable distraction, fetched an album of her own watercolors, and proceeded to turn the pages for the benefit of her guest. When the clock on the mantelpiece chimed 8 in the piercing tones, Mary could bear it no longer. This dragging inactivity was worse than danger and pursuit. "Forgive me," she said, rising to her feet. "You have been so kind, and I can never thank you enough, but I am anxious, desperately anxious. I can think of nothing but my poor aunt, who at this moment may be suffering the tortures of hell. I must know what is happening at Jamaica Inn if I walk back there myself tonight." Mrs. Bassett dropped her album in a flutter of distress. "Of course you are anxious. I've seen it all along and tried to take your mind off it. How terrible it is. But I am as concerned as you are for my husband's sake. But you cannot possibly walk back there now, alone. Why, it would be after midnight before you arrived, and heaven knows what might not happen to you on the way. I will order the trap, and Richard shall go with you. He is most trustworthy and dependable. You can be armed in case of need. If there is fighting in progress, you should see it from the bottom of the hill and would not approach it till it was over. I would come with you myself, but my health is delicate at the moment, and, of course, you do nothing of the kind," said Mary swiftly. "I am used to danger and the road by night, and you are not. I shall be putting you to very great trouble in harnessing your horse at this hour and rousing your groom. I assure you I am no longer tired. I can walk." But Mrs. Bassett had already pulled the bell. "Have word sent to Richards to bring the trap round immediately," she said to the astonished servant. "I will give him further orders when he arrives. Tell him there must be as little delay as possible." She then fitted Mary out with a heavy cloak and hood, thick rug and foot warmer, protesting all the while that only her state of health prevented her from making the journey too, for which Mary was utterly thankful, Mrs. Bassett being hardly the ideal companion for so improvident and dangerous an escape. In a quarter of an hour, the trap drove up to the door, with Richards in charge, Mary recognizing him at once as the servant who had ridden with Mr. Bassett originally to Jamaica Inn. His reluctance at leaving his fireside on a Sunday night was soon overcome when he learnt his mission, and with 2 large pistols stuck in his belt and orders to fire at anyone who threatened the trap, he assumed at once an air of truculence and authority hitherto unknown to him. Mary climbed in beside him, the dogs baying a chorus of farewell, and it was only when the drive twisted and the house was out of sight that Mary realized she had set out on what was probably a foolhardy and dangerous expedition. Anything might have happened during the 5 hours she had been absent from Jamaica Inn, and even with the trap she could scarcely hope to arrive there before 10:30. She could make no plans, and her action depended upon the moment when it came. With the moon now high in the sky and the soft air blowing upon her, she felt emboldened to face disaster when it came, and this ride to the scene of action, however dangerous, was better than sitting like a helpless child listening to the prattle of Mrs. Bassett. This man Richards was armed, and she herself would use a gun if necessary. He was burning with curiosity, of course, but she gave short answers to his questions and did not encourage him. The drive was silent then, for the most part, with no other sound but the steady clopping of the horses' hoofs upon the road, and now and again a howl hooted from the still trees. The rustle of hedgerow and the creeping sounds of the country whispers were left behind when the trap came out upon the Bodmin road, and once again the dark moor stretched out on either side, lapping the road like a desert. The ribbon of the highway shone white under the moon. It wound and was lost in the fold of the further hill, bare and untrodden. There were no travelers but themselves upon the road tonight. On Christmas Eve, when Mary had ridden here, the wind had lashed venomously at the carriage wheels, and the rain hammered the windows. Now the air was still cold, and strangely still, and the moor itself lay placid and silver in the moonlight. The dark tors held their sleeping faces to the sky, the granite features softened and smoothed by the light that bathed them. Theirs was a peaceful mood, and the old god slept undisturbed. Briskly the horse and trap covered the weary miles that Mary had walked alone. She recognized each bend in the road now, and at times the moor encroached upon it, with high tufts of grass or twisted stems of broom. There, beyond her in the valley, would be the lights of Alternon, and already 5 lanes branched out from the road like fingers from a hand. The wild stretch of Jamaica lay before them. Even when the night was still, the winds played here, bare and open as it was to every compass point, and tonight it hummed from Rough Tor on the west, keen as a knife and cold, gathering the marsh smells as it came over the bitter turf and the running streams. There was still no sign of man or beast upon the road, which rose and dipped again across the moor, and though Mary strained her eyes and her ears, she could hear nothing. On such a night, the slightest sound would be magnified, and the approach of Mr. Bassett's party, numbering as they would, 12 men or so, said Richards, would easily be heard 2 miles or more away. We shall find them there before us, as likely or not, he told Mary, and the landlord with his hands bound, breathing fire at the squire. It will be a good thing for the neighborhood when we's put out of harm's way. We would have been there before if the squire could have had his way. It's a pity we were not here sooner. There'll have been some sport in taking him in, I reckon. A little sport if Mr. Bassett finds his bird is flown, said Mary quietly. Joss Merlin knows these moors like the back of his hand, and he'll not linger once the start of an hour, or less than that. My master has bred here, same as the landlord, said Richards. If it comes to a chase across country, I'd lay odds on the squire every time. He's hunted here, man and boy, for nearly 50 years, I should say, and where a fox will go into the squire will follow. But they'll catch this one before he starts to run, if I'm not mistaken. Mary let him continue. His occasional jerky statements did not worry her as the kindly prattle of his mistress had done, and his broad back and honest, rugged face gave her some confidence in this night of strain. They were approaching the dip in the road, and the narrow bridge that spanned the River Foy. Mary could hear the ripple and play of the stream as it ran swiftly over the stones. The steep hill to Jamaica rose in front of them, white beneath the moon, and as the dark chimneys appeared above the crest, Richards fell silent, fumbling with the pistols in his belt, and he cleared his throat with a nervous jerk of his head. Mary's heart beat fast now, and she held tight to the side of the trap. The horse bent to the climb, his head low, and it seemed to Mary that the clop of his hoofs rang too loudly on the surface of the road, and she wished they had been more silent. As they drew near to the summit of the hill, Richards turned and whispered in her ear, "Would it be best for you to wait here, in the trap, by the side of the road, and I go forward and see if they're there?" Mary shook her head. "Better for me to go," she said, "and you follow a pace or two behind, or stay here and wait until I call. From the silence, it seems as though the squire and his party are not yet come after all, and that the landlord has escaped. Should he be there, however, my uncle, I can risk an encounter with him when you could not. Give me a pistol. I shall have little fear from him then." "I hardly think it right for you to go alone," said the man doubtfully. "You may walk right into him, and I hear no sound from you again. It is strange, you say, this silence. I'd expected shouting and fighting, and my master's voice topping it all. It's almost unnatural in a way. They must have detained and lost him. I half fancy there'll be more wisdom if he turned aside down that track there and waited for them to come." "I've waited long enough tonight and gone half mad with it," said Mary. "I'd rather come upon my uncle face to face than lie here in the ditch, seeing and hearing nothing. It's my aunt I'm thinking of. She's as innocent as a child in all this business, and I want to care for her if I can. Give me a pistol and let me go. I can tread like a cat, and I'll not run my head into a noose, I promise you." She threw off the heavy cloak and hood that had protected her from the cold night air, and seized hold of the pistol that he handed down to her reluctantly. "Don't follow me unless I call or give some signal," she said. "Should you hear a shot fired, then perhaps it would be as well to come after me. But come warily for all that. There's no need for both of us to run like fools into danger. For my part, I believe my uncle to have gone." Okay, I'm going to stop there because it's time. It's almost time. Whoo! Okay, so we are on page 277, the top of. She is leaving Richards. She's taking her pistol. She's going in. Just when I think Mary Yellan can't get any braver, she jumps off her roof, walks 8 miles to try to find help, goes back to trouble, and now is saying, "I got this," to the guy who walked with her and who drove her there, and he's letting her go. She's not really giving him much of a choice, but yeah, Catherine, wow. Mary is the hero of this story, that she's not messing around. I'm very proud of her. She makes some terrible choices, but what are you going to do? All right, next time. We are 80 pages away from the finale of this, so probably like 2 more sessions. But next time we'll see who, if anyone, is at the inn and what has happened. So speculation awaits until next time. Thank you for joining me today. I will see you. Thank you, Catherine. I will see you all next time. Have a safe and wonderful day. Drink lots of water. Be safe out there. Bye.